During today's lunchtime tutorial, a group of us were looking at writing introductions and preparations for the next essay. And so what we looked at here was a case study from Handmaid's Tale, and the challenge that we have when writing an introduction is how to capture the essence of the question, but also how to think our way through and lead our introduction towards a thesis statement. So the question we used for our case study was this one. Writers often use established genres and generic conventions to comment on the social, cultural and or historical conditions. Discuss with reference to one or more texts you have studied. This is a question from a past exam, and it's pretty standard in some ways. And so if we look here, what I've done is done one sample here. So I'll read it to you. Writers use established conventions of novels often to create a recognizable set of expectations for their readership. These are not a rigid set of rules, but they can function as a way of shortcutting our way to the novel's central comment on society. Margaret Atwood's 1986 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, makes use of the well-established genre of dystopian fiction to comment on her world. My contention is that her use of dystopian fiction as a genre is essential to her critique of the 1980s backlash against feminism and indeed the civil rights movements of the 20th century in general. Now, the thinking that went in this introduction began with the broad sense of genre and a broad sense of what genres are, leading into this idea of dystopian fiction. I probably could have or you should have used speculative fiction there even, and then leading at the end to a thesis statement. My contention is that her use of this genre is essential to her critique. That's one way to do it. But when I was halfway through drafting this one here, and this paragraph here was the result of first draft, just thinking aloud writing, I actually changed my mind to how I wanted to approach it. And so I came up with this introduction, which is a little bit longer, but I've led with this idea of dystopian fiction. Dystopian fiction has a long tradition of critiquing the social and cultural conditions of the world in which they are produced. Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World are seminal in this genre and have shaped the way successive generations have thought about power in the state. In 1986, this canon of dystopian fiction found an addition in Margaret Atwood's feminist dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Where Orwell wrote in fear of the emergence of totalitarianism in the years preceding 1948, Atwood wrote in fear of the emergence of religious fundamentalism and anti-feminist dogma in the 1980s. It is Atwood's postmodern slant on the dystopian novel that is central to our understanding of her critique of the main ideological threat to freedom in the 1980s. Now this one here admittedly is a little bit wordy, probably far too wordy, but when I compare it to the last one, it has a little bit more meat to it. And so what this reveals is how the thinking evolved in writing both of these. The thinking on this first one began with this concept of what genre is, going back to the question here, that writers often use established genres and generic conventions to comment. So I led my thinking with the idea of seeing genre as a set of expectations that form a bit of a relationship between writer and reader. And then I moved into how that relates to Handmaid's Tale, and then finished with a thesis statement. My writing style is that I like to finish my introductions with a thesis statement, and that does two things. It makes sure my reader knows what I'm arguing, but secondly, I find that it disciplines me to make sure that my first body paragraph leads very strongly. But the reason I changed my mind to move to this one is that I wanted to just make very brief allusions to Orwell and Huxley so that I wouldn't have to explain why I'm referring to them if I wanted to use them in the body. If in the body of my essay I mention 1984 Brave New World, my reader has seen me mention this in an introduction, and I don't have to lose too many words creating a segue into it. I've also added in references to the postmodern slant, so that way if I feel as I'm writing under pressure during an exam, I want to go into this this postmodern interpretation or this postmodern slant on speculative fiction, then I can go there, and I've signaled that in my introduction. But what I've also not done is that here I haven't shopping listed what I'm going to do. And those shopping lists can really annoy markers and something to avoid. And so there's elements of both of these that need a bit of work. I emphasize again, these were both first draft writing that were done to show how thinking worked. So they could use more polish. But that's the point, is that when you write in an exam situation, you're not going to have time for that kind of polish. And so showing you these thought process here has some value. So I hope this helps you out in your preparations for the next essay and for the exams.